Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is D-Day Preparations, and we're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you read more about the Normandy landings and invasion that began on the 6th of June 1944, you can use these terms as a way to key in on a very complex series of operations that took place beginning on the morning of the 6th. Let's get into it. The first term for us is Arcadia. Now, Arcadia stands for a conference that took place beginning in December of 1941 in the aftermath of the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the entry of the United States into the Second World War against Japan and against the nation of Germany. Pretty soon after this, you see British diplomats and politicians, and Winston Churchill even comes over, the Prime Minister, and a number of British officers to begin conferencing with their American counterparts in coordinating operations for the conduct of the war all over the world. And in that initial Arcadia conference, you have a number of different conversations that take place about opening up a battlefront in Europe, when that battlefront is going to be opened up in Europe, and how long will it take? How many divisions? What is the character of that kind of invasion going to look like? And you, of course, had differences in approaches from the American perspective, from individuals like General Marshall, and you had different perspectives from the British as well about where the overall focus should be. The second term for us is a joint one, Operation Bodyguard and Operation Fortitude. Eventually, once the Allies conference together and decide that a process of opening up a much larger ground second front in Europe would take place, and it would take place generally beginning in France. Once you had that process nailed down, there needed to be a process of deception. There was grave concern that any kind of invasion force would be met with great resistance on the part of the Germans, and so there needed to be misdirection from the Allies in order to really make it unclear for the Germans where the Americans and where the British and others were going to be landing. So Operation Bodyguard is kind of the overall aegis of this deception process, and Operation Fortitude, and there's 2 parts to that. There's Fortitude North and Fortitude South, and in each case, the goal is to try to be able to convince the Germans that the Allies are going to be landing in a couple of different places. So instead of Normandy, that they're going to be invading up into Norway. Instead of Normandy, they're going to be attacking the Pas-de-Calais, right? Sort of these kinds of places. And this brings me to my third point, which is General Patton. General Patton. George Patton had been a prominent military officer in the United States Army. During the First World War, he was already a very well-known figure, having been in the Olympics for the Americans, was known as being rather brash, was in the first tank battle that ever took place, the Battle of Cambrai. He is well noted for his reorganization of the army in North Africa and for his role in the Allied landings in Sicily. But Patton was also a very troubled figure and did not consider post-traumatic stress to be a recognizable thing at all, and notedly assaulted a couple of his soldiers. Patton was brought back, sort of relieved, kind of brought to England, and then eventually given a chance, but essentially kind of used as part of this overall deception campaign. And this is also the time period of what's called the Ghost Army, where you have a real army of deception that is taking place really throughout England during this period, 1943 into 1944, to genuinely convince the Germans that there is a significant military operation that is being prepared, but it's one that they really have no understanding of where this is going to go. I mean, they bring in Hollywood set designers to sort of design things. I mean, it really is quite fascinating. All right. The fourth point for us are mulberries. We're not talking about a bush. We're not talking about a tree. We're talking about a temporary harbor. Now, logistics wins wars, and the Allies recognized that when they were to open up a second front, that a very key thing they would need to do quickly is to be able to create effective supply lines for their units to be able to advance across France as rapidly as possible. And so one of the many forms of innovations and processes that occur during the logistical buildup for a couple of million soldiers in the UK to begin, taking part in this invasion, is they would not have access to significant harbors right at the beginning. And so they would need to create their own. And so these mulberries, which are these big concrete and metal structures that are partly hollowed out, so you can bring them across the channel and then eventually kind of set them up as breakers so that you can then bring ships in, were really a very interesting component to the overall Allied planning process and a real sign of how far they were taking this. All right. The fifth term for us is kind of a double. The first is quadrant and the next is Tehran. The quadrant stands for a conference that takes place in Quebec, and Tehran for an Allied conference that takes place in Tehran. In both cases, these kinds of conferences were essential for Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and for others to gather, but particularly for Roosevelt and Churchill to gather, as well as with Stalin, in order to discuss what the Allied invasion was going to look like, and of course, where it was going to take place and where the final landings were going to occur at. And of course, all of that is finalized at Tehran. All right. Thank you very much.